Tom Richardson had inherited the lake cabin from his grandfather 8 years ago and never expected it would become the center of a war with the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. The rustic log structure sat on 2 acres of pristine, shorelined along Lake Meridian, and had been in his family for over 60 years. When his grandfather built it in the early 1960s, the area was nothing but wilderness and a handful of scattered hunting lodges. Times had changed dramatically since then. The trouble began on a crisp October morning when Tom arrived at the cabin for his annual deer hunting preparation. He found a certified letter taped to his front door bearing the official seal of the Willowbrook Heights HOA. The letter was signed by Patricia Henley, HOA president, and demanded his immediate compliance with a newly enacted shoreline beautification ordinance. According to the letter, Tom had 30 days to remove what they termed unsightly hunting equipment, including his deer stands, tree blinds, and processing shed, or face daily fines of $500. Tom read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. The HOA claimed authority over his property based on covenants that supposedly ran with the land when the surrounding development was built 5 years earlier. They insisted that his hunting activities were incompatible with the upscale residential character they were trying to maintain. The letter also mentioned complaints from homeowners about gunfire during hunting season and the presence of what they called agricultural structures, meaning his modest processing shed where he cleaned his harvest. What infuriated Tom most was that he had never agreed to join any HOA. His property predated their development by decades, and he had never signed any covenants or agreements. Yet somehow they were claiming legal authority over his land use decisions. The letter referenced specific deed restrictions and easements that Tom had never seen or agreed to. He immediately called his attorney, Jake Morrison, who had handled the estate transfer when Tom inherited the property. Jake listened carefully as Tom read the letter over the phone. There was a long pause before Jake responded with concern evident in his voice. He explained that developers sometimes included adjacent properties in their covenants through legal mechanisms that existing property owners might not be aware of. Jake recommended that Tom bring all his property documents to the office immediately so they could research the claims being made by the HOA. The next morning, Tom met with Jake in his downtown office overlooking the courthouse square. They spread out decades of property documents across the conference table, including the original deed from when his grandfather purchased the land, the inheritance papers, and various survey maps. Jake also pulled up digital records from the county assessor's office and the recorder of deeds. What they discovered made Tom's blood boil. When the Willowbrook Heights development was approved 5 years earlier, the developer had somehow managed to include Tom's property in the overall planned unit development, even though Tom had never consented. The County Planning Commission had apparently treated his land as part of the larger development for zoning purposes. While this didn't automatically make Tom subject to HOA rules, it created enough legal ambiguity that the HOA felt confident in asserting authority. Jake explained that proving to Tom's independence from the HOA would require expensive litigation that could drag on for months or years. The HOA had significant financial resources from hundreds of member dues and could afford to outlast most individual property owners in court. Even if Tom eventually won, the legal fees alone could bankrupt him. Jake recommended trying to negotiate a settlement that would allow Tom to continue his hunting activities while making some cosmetic concessions to appease the HOA. Tom rejected that approach immediately. His grandfather had hunted these woods for 40 years, and Tom wasn't about to let a bunch of suburban newcomers dictate how he used his own land. He told Jake to research every possible legal avenue for fighting the HOA while he figured out his own strategy. Tom had spent 20 years as a wildlife biologist before retiring, and he knew more about land use law than most people realized. Over the next week, Tom researched everything he could find about HOA authority and property rights. He discovered that while HOAs had broad powers within their legitimate jurisdiction, they had no authority over properties that were never properly included in their covenants. The key was proving that his property had never been legally subjected to HOA control. Despite what the development paperwork might suggest, Tom also learned about an interesting legal concept called conservation easements. If he could establish his property as a formal wildlife preserve or hunting preserve, he might be able to claim protection under state conservation laws that superseded local HOA regulations. The state had been encouraging private landowners to dedicate their properties to conservation purposes through various incentive programs. The idea began forming in Tom's mind as he walked the shoreline of his property. His 2 acres were just the tip of what could become a much larger conservation area. The entire southern shore of Lake Meridian was still undeveloped wilderness owned by the state forestry department. If Tom could somehow gain control over or management rights to that larger area, he could create a legitimate hunting preserve that would be completely beyond HOA jurisdiction. Tom spent the next several days hiking through the state forestry land that bordered his property. The area was spectacular, with dense hardwood forests, rolling hills, and pristine wetlands that attracted waterfowl throughout the year. He counted signs of deer, turkey, wild boar, and even a few elk that had been reintroduced to the region. The land had tremendous potential as a managed hunting preserve, but the state seemed to be doing nothing with it. Research at the State Forestry Office revealed that the land had been declared surplus several years earlier, when budget cuts forced the consolidation of several forest management areas. The property was technically available for lease or purchase by qualified conservation organizations, but the bureaucratic process was complex and expensive. Most importantly, the state gave preference to applicants who could demonstrate legitimate conservation or wildlife management purposes. Tom realized he had found his answer. If he could acquire management rights to the state land and combine it with his own property, he could create a legally recognized hunting preserve covering hundreds of acres along the lake shore. Such a preserve would be protected by state conservation laws that explicitly superseded local zoning and HOA regulations. The Willowbrook Heights HOA would have no authority whatsoever over a state-sanctioned wildlife preserve. The first step was establishing himself as a legitimate conservation agent. Tom formed the Lake Meridian Wildlife Conservation Trust with himself as president and sole trustee. He drafted articles of incorporation stating that the organization's purpose was preserving wildlife habitat and providing sustainable hunting opportunities for the public. Jake helped him file the paperwork and obtain federal taxes, its exempt status as a conservation nonprofit. While waiting for the nonprofit status to be approved, Tom began documenting the wildlife population on his property and the adjacent state land. He set up trail cameras throughout the area and began maintaining detailed logs of animal sightings, feeding patterns, and habitat usage. This scientific data would be crucial in demonstrating that the area deserved protection as critical wildlife habitat. Tom also reached out to other hunters and conservation groups throughout the state. He discovered a network of sportsmen who were frustrated by the loss of hunting opportunities as rural areas were developed into suburban subdivisions. Many were willing to contribute financially to preserving one of the few remaining pristine hunting areas in the region. Within a month, Tom had raised over $50,000 in pledges to support the Wildlife Preserve project. The breakthrough came when Tom contacted Dr. Maria Santos, a wildlife ecology professor at the State University who had been studying the Lake Meridian ecosystem for her research. Dr. Santos was thrilled to learn about Tom's conservation plans and immediately offered to provide scientific support for the project. Her preliminary surveys had identified several rare species in the area that would benefit from formal habitat protection. Dr. Santos helped Tom prepare a comprehensive wildlife management plan for the proposed preserve. The plan included detailed habitat improvement projects, seasonal hunting guidelines, and a monitoring program to track the health of wildlife populations. Most importantly, it demonstrated that managed hunting was actually beneficial for maintaining ecological balance by controlling deer populations that might otherwise damage the forest ecosystem. Armed with scientific backing, substantial financial support, and a detailed management plan, Tom submitted his application to lease the state forestry land. The application requested a 25-year renewable lease on 800 acres of shoreline forest adjacent to his property. The proposed Lake Meridian Hunting Preserve would offer guided hunts, educational programs, and habitat research opportunities while generating revenue for the state. through lease payments and hunting permit fees. The state forestry department was impressed by the thoroughness of Tom's application and the level of scientific support he had assembled. They scheduled a site visit to evaluate the property and meet with Tom about his management plans. The visit went extremely well, with forestry officials expressing enthusiasm for having a private organization take responsibility for managing an area they no longer had resources to maintain properly. While his application worked its way through the state approval process, Tom continued to document everything the HOA was doing. Patricia Henley had begun sending increasingly threatening letters demanding compliance with their beautification standards. She had also started showing up at his property uninvited to take photographs of what she called violations, including his perfectly legal hunting stands and processing shed. Tom installed security cameras around his property after discovering that someone had been trespassing and leaving orange spray paint marks on trees he planned to use for hunting stands. The cameras captured Patricia Henley and 2 other HOA board members walking through his woods and marking trees they wanted removed. Tom had them arrested for criminal trespassing and vandalism, which only escalated the HOA retaliated by filing a lawsuit seeking immediate injunctive relief to stop what they called illegal hunting activities on property subject to their covenants. They claimed that Tom's hunting activities violated noise ordinances, created safety hazards, and damaged property values throughout the development. The lawsuit asked for monetary damages and demanded that Tom cease all hunting-related activities immediately, Jake advised Tom that fighting the lawsuit would be expensive and time-consuming, even though they had strong grounds for dismissal. The HOA was clearly hoping to pressure Tom into submission through legal costs and harassment. Jake estimated that defending against the lawsuit could easily cost $30,000 or more, even if they won decisively. Tom refused to be intimidated. He instructed Jake to file a vigorous defense and to countersue the HOA for harassment, abuse of process, and interference with his property rights. Tom also filed criminal complaints against the HOA board members for trespassing, vandalism, and stalking. If they wanted to escalate the conflict, Tom was prepared to fight on every front. The legal battle intensified over the following weeks, with both sides filing multiple motions and discovery requests. The HOA hired an expensive law firm from the state capital and began deposing everyone who had any connection to Tom's property, including neighbors, former hunting guests, and even his grandfather's old friends. They were clearly trying to build a case that Tom's hunting activities created a public nuisance that justified HOA intervention. Tom used the discovery process to his advantage by demanding all documents related to how the HOA claimed authority over his property. What emerged was a pattern of questionable legal tactics that had been used to expand HOA control beyond the original development boundaries. The developer had apparently worked with the county planning office to include adjacent properties and zoning changes without proper notification of affected landowners. The most damaging revelation came when Tom's attorney subpoenaed emails between HOA board members and the developer. The emails showed a deliberate strategy to eliminate hunting activities throughout the area in order to maintain property values and attract upscale buyers. They had specifically targeted Tom because his visible hunting activities were seen as incompatible with the luxury image they wanted to project. One email from Patricia Henley to the developer was particularly damning. She wrote that getting rid of the crazy hunter and his disgusting deer processing operation was essential to their long-term marketing strategy. She suggested that if they could force Tom to sell his property, the developer could purchase it and extend the golf course they were planning for the development. Jake immediately filed a motion to dismiss the HOA's lawsuit based on their lack of standing and improper motives. He argued that the HOA had never established legitimate authority over Tom's property and was pursuing the litigation solely to benefit the developer who still controlled the HOA board. The evidence of conspiracy between the HOA and developer to eliminate hunting activities for commercial purposes undermined any claim that they were acting to enforce legitimate covenants. While the lawsuit continued to wind through the courts, Tom received the news he had been waiting for. The State Forestry Department approved his application to lease 800 acres for the Lake Meridian Hunting Preserve. The lease agreement gave Tom exclusive management rights to the property for 25 years with options for renewal. More importantly, the lease specifically designated the area as a state-sanctioned wildlife preserve with all the legal protections that their status provided. Tom immediately began implementing his wildlife management plan with help from Dr. Santos and volunteers from hunting organizations throughout the state. They established food plots to improve wildlife nutrition, created brush piles for small game habitat, and built a network of trails for hunters and wildlife observers. The preserve officially opened for limited hunting during the fall season, with all proceeds supporting habitat improvement projects. The HOA was furious when they learned about the hunting preserve designation. Patricia Henley held an emergency board meeting and authorized their attorneys to challenge the state lease in federal court. They argued that the state had no authority to approve hunting activities that violated local HOA covenants and zoning restrictions. The HOA claimed that state approval of the hunting preserve interfered with their property rights and damaged the value of homes in their development. The federal lawsuit proved to be a massive strategic error for the HOA. Federal courts were required to follow established precedent that state conservation programs superseded local land use restrictions. The judge dismissed the HOA's claims within 60 days and awarded attorney fees to Tom for having to defend against what the court called a frivolous lawsuit designed to harass a legitimate conservation operation. The dismissal of their federal Desto lawsuit marked the beginning of the end for the HOA's campaign against Tom. Their state court lawsuit was also dismissed when the judge ruled that they had never established legitimate authority over Tom's property. The court found that the original development covenants were improperly drafted and never legally binding on pre-existing properties like Tom's family cabin. Tom was not satisfied with simply winning the lawsuits. He wanted to make sure the HOA could never again harass property owners or abuse their limited authority. Working with Jake, he filed a comprehensive lawsuit against the HOA, the developer, and individual board members seeking damages for harassment, abusive process, interference with business relationships, and violation of his civil rights under federal law. The civil rights claims were particularly powerful because they alleged a conspiracy to deprive Tom of his constitutional property rights through color of law. The HOA board members had claimed governmental authority. They did not possess and use that false authority to threaten fines and legal action. Federal civil rights law provided for significant monetary damages and attorney fees when public officials or those acting under color of law violated constitutional rights. Discovery in the civil rights lawsuit revealed even more damaging evidence of the HOA's misconduct. Internal documents showed that they had hired a private investigator to spy on Tom and had attempted to pressure the county sheriff into preventing hunting activities on Tom's property. They had also contacted Tom's employer and tried to get him fired by claiming he was operating an illegal commercial hunting operation. The private investigator had compiled a detailed dossier on Tom, including photographs of his daily activities, financial records, and personal information about his family members. The HOA had used this information to try to find legal vulnerabilities they could exploit to force him off his property. The investigative report included recommendations for filing false complaints with various government agencies to harass Tom with regulatory investigations. Evidence also emerged that the HOA had been systematically targeting other property owners, who they viewed as incompatible with their vision for the area. An elderly farmer whose land bordered the development had been subjected to similar harassment, including frivolous lawsuits and attempts to have his agricultural exemption revoked. A family that operated a small fishing guide service had been forced to shut down after the HOA flooded regulatory agencies with complaints about their boat launches. The pattern of abuse convinced several other victims to join Tom's lawsuit as additional plaintiffs. Together, they presented a compelling case that the HOA had engaged in a systematic campaign to eliminate land uses they disapproved of, regardless of whether they had legal authority to do so. The conspiracy had caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages through legal fees, lost income, and emotional distress. Settlement negotiations. began after the HOA's insurance company realized they faced potentially catastrophic liability. The insurance policy covered mistakes and omissions in governance, but not intentional civil rights violations or criminal conduct. Individual board members were facing personal bankruptcy if the case went to trial and resulted in significant damage awards. Patricia Henley was the first to break ranks and seek a separate settlement. Her personal assets included a vacation home and retirement accounts that could be seized to satisfy a judgment. She agreed to testify against the other defendants in exchange for a reduced settlement amount. Her testimony revealed the full extent of the conspiracy and provided smoking gun evidence of intentional wrongdoing. The developer also sought to settle quickly once Patricia Henley began cooperating with Tom's attorneys. The developer had the most to lose, since the conspiracy was designed to benefit his ongoing development projects. He agreed to pay substantial damages and to modify all future development covenants to explicitly exclude pre-existing properties. Like Tom's cabin, the remaining HOA board members held out longer, but eventually agreed to a settlement that included both monetary damages and structural reforms to prevent future abuse. The settlement required the HOA to adopt new governance procedures, including independent legal review of all enforcement actions and a property owner appeal process. Board members were also required to complete training on property rights and HOA authority limits. Tom used his settlement money to expand the hunting preserve and improve facilities for visiting hunters. He purchased additional land adjacent to his state lease and built a modern lodge that could accommodate hunting parties and conservation groups. The preserve became a model for sustainable wildlife management and generated significant revenue for habitat improvement projects. The success of the Lake Meridian Hunting Preserve attracted attention from conservation organizations and government agencies throughout the region. Tom was invited to speak at conferences about private conservation partnerships and was appointed to several state wildlife management committees. His expertise in both wildlife biology and property rights law made him a valuable advocate for landowner conservation programs. Dr. Santos continued her research on the preserve and published several academic papers documenting the positive impact of managed hunting on ecosystem health. Her work showed that the hunting preserve supported higher wildlife diversity and better habitat quality than surrounding areas that were either developed or left completely unmanaged. The scientific validation strengthened Tom's position and provided additional protection against any future challenges to the preserve. The HOA attempted to rebuild its reputation after the scandal, but many homeowners had lost confidence in the board leadership. Several board members resigned in disgrace, and new leadership took a much more conservative approach to enforcement actions. The association also hired new legal counsel and implemented strict procedures to prevent future abuse of authority. Patricia Henley moved away from the area after the settlement and sold her home in the development. Her replacement as HOA president was a retired teacher who focused on basic maintenance issues and community events rather than aggressive enforcement campaigns. The new leadership reached out to Tom and other affected property owners to rebuild relationships damaged by the previous board's misconduct. Tom occasionally encountered residents of the development while working on the preserve, but most interactions were positive. Many homeowners appreciated having a professionally managed wildlife area adjacent to their community and enjoyed watching deer and other wildlife from their backyards. Some even asked about participating in educational programs or volunteer habitat improvement projects on the preserve. The transformation of the conflict from a bitter legal battle to a successful conservation partnership demonstrated the power of standing up to institutional bullying. Tom had refused to be intimidated by threats and legal harassment and had instead used his knowledge and resources to create something positive for the entire community. The hunting preserve became a source of pride rather than controversy and generated economic benefits for the local area through hunting tourism and conservation programs. Years later, Tom often reflected on how the HOA's attempt to force him off his property had actually led to creating something far greater than he originally imagined. What began as a family cabin and small hunting property had grown into a significant wildlife preserve that would benefit future generations. The legal victory had not only protected his own rights, but it also established important precedents that helped other property owners facing similar harassment. The Lake Meridian Hunting Preserve continued to expand its programs and impact under Tom's leadership. He developed partnerships with youth organizations to provide hunting, education, and wildlife conservation training. The preserve also hosted corporate retreats and team-building events that combined outdoor recreation with environmental education. Revenue from these programs supported ongoing habitat improvements and research projects. Tom eventually hired additional staff to help manage the growing operation, including a full-time wildlife biologist and hunting guides. The preserve became an important local employer and contributed significantly to the regional economy. Through visitor spending on lodging, meals, and equipment, what had started as a personal property rights battle had evolved into a successful social enterprise that benefited the entire community. The story of Tom's fight against the HOA became legendary among property rights advocates and hunting communities. Throughout the state, he was frequently invited to speak at legal seminars and property owner meetings about strategies for defending against institutional overreach. His experience demonstrated that with proper preparation, legal knowledge, and determination, individual property owners could successfully challenge even well-funded opponents. Tom also became involved in lobbying for state legislation to strengthen property rights and limit HOA authority. His first-hand experience with abuse of power provided compelling testimony for bills that would require HOAs to prove legitimate authority before taking enforcement action against property owners. Several states passed laws inspired by Tom's case that provided better protection for property owners facing HOA harassment. The legal precedents established in Tom's case were cited in dozens of subsequent lawsuits involving HOA overreach and property rights violations. Courts increasingly recognized that HOAs could not simply claim authority over properties without clear legal foundation, and that property owners had strong remedies available when that authority was abused. The civil rights theories developed in Tom's case became a powerful tool for fighting institutional harassment. As Tom entered his 70s, he began planning for the long-term future of the hunting preserve. He established an endowment fund to ensure permanent protection of the wildlife habitat and hunting opportunities he had worked so hard to create. The preserve had become his legacy, and he wanted to make sure it would continue serving conservation and recreational purposes for generations to come. The endowment was structured to provide funding for ongoing habitat management research programs and public access to hunting and wildlife observation opportunities. Tom also created a board of trustees, including Dr. Santos and other conservation professionals, to provide governance and oversight after his retirement. The structure ensured that the preserve would remain true to its original conservation mission. Regardless of future ownership changes, Tom often brought visiting hunters and conservation groups to the spot, where his grandfather's cabin still stood overlooking Lake Meridian. He would tell them the story of how one family's determination to protect their heritage had grown into something that benefited an entire ecosystem and community. The cabin remained rustic and unchanged, serving as a reminder of the simple beginning that had led to such extraordinary results. The wildlife populations on the preserve thrived under professional management and scientific monitoring. Deer numbers were maintained at optimal levels through carefully controlled hunting while habitat improvements supported increased populations of turkey, wild boar, waterfowl, and other game species. The preserve also provided crucial habitat for non-game species, including several rare birds that had returned to the area as forest management improved. Educational programs on the preserve reached thousands of young people each year, teaching them about wildlife conservation, habitat management, and the important role that hunting played in ecosystem health. Many participants went on to pursue careers in wildlife biology, natural resource management, or conservation law enforcement. The preserve had become an important training ground for the next generation of conservation professionals. Tom took particular pride in the relationships he had built with other landowners throughout the region who had been inspired by his example to dedicate their properties to conservation purposes. A network of private hunting preserves and conservation areas had developed around Lake Meridian, creating a corridor of protected habitat that benefited wildlife populations throughout the watershed. The collaborative approach had achieved far more than any individual property owner could have accomplished alone. The success of the lake Meridian model attracted attention from government agencies seeking cost-effective approaches to wildlife management on limited budgets. Tom frequently consulted with state and federal officials about policies that would encourage private conservation efforts while maintaining appropriate oversight and public access. His practical experience managing a successful preserve provided valuable insights into what worked and what barriers needed to be removed. International conservation organizations also took note of the Lake Meridian Preserve as an example of how private initiative could achieve significant conservation results when supported by appropriate legal frameworks. Tom hosted delegations from several countries that were developing policies to encourage private conservation efforts similar to what he had accomplished. The preserve became a model for sustainable hunting, tourism, and community-based conservation programs. As Tom reflected on the decades since his initial confrontation with the HOA, he realized that their attempt to force him off his property had actually been the catalyst for achieving something far more important than simply protecting his own rights. The hunting preserve had become a symbol of what could be accomplished when individuals refused to be intimidated by institutional power, and instead channeled their energy into creating positive change. The preserve continued to evolve and grow. Under Tom's leadership, with new programs and partnerships being added regularly, research conducted on the property contributed to scientific understanding of forest ecology, wildlife management, and sustainable hunting practices. The economic impact of the preserve supported local businesses and provided employment opportunities. In rural areas where good jobs were often scarce, most importantly, the preserve demonstrated that conservation and recreational hunting could coexist successfully when properly managed. The wildlife populations were healthier and more diverse than they had been before active management began, and hunting opportunities were sustainable over the long term. The model proved that private conservation efforts could achieve results that benefited both wildlife and human communities. Tom often thought about his grandfather, who had first brought him to hunt in these woods as a young boy. His grandfather had taught him that the land was something to be treasured and protected for future generations, not just exploited for short-term gain. The hunting preserve had honored that legacy, while creating something even greater than his grandfather could have imagined. The story had come full circle from a simple family hunting cabin to a professionally managed wildlife preserve that served as a model for conservation efforts throughout the region and beyond. What had started as a defensive action to protect property rights had evolved into a proactive program that created lasting benefits for wildlife, habitat hunting opportunities, and local economic development. Tom knew that the preserve would continue long after he was gone, providing wildlife habitat hunting opportunities and conservation education for generations to come. The legal protections he had fought so hard to establish would ensure that no future HOA or development pressure could threaten the area's conservation status. His victory over institutional overreach had created something permanent and meaningful. That would be his lasting contribution to the conservation cause he cared so deeply about.